Hey guys, welcome back. This is our SOL8 Westward Migration, Industrial Revolution, Gilded Age, and Progressive Era lecture. Let's start this off by taking a look at this political cartoon, okay? Just to give you guys kind of an idea of what's going on in the late 1800s. So between the Civil War and say 1900 and then into the early 1900s. Like we said in our last lecture, our economy is booming. There's a lot of growth, okay? But if you look at this term right here, Gilded Age, let me get my pen right. This term right here, Gilded Age, Mark Twain coined that term. If something is gilded, all right, that means it's coated in something shiny. So it's like a gold coated or brass coated thing. It's shiny on the surface, right? But if you scratch it just beneath the surface, it's cheap metal. It's dirty. So it's shiny on the surface, kind of ugly just beneath the surface. And that is a really good way to describe America in the late 19th, early 20th century. Lots of growth, lots of progress. It's an economic boom time. But if you look just beneath the surface, it's pretty nasty, and we'll get into why. So let's look at this political cartoon. All right, this is one of the issues that we've got going on. There are all of these big corporations in the late 1800s, and they're monopolies. They're trusts. So you have Standard Oil right here, and the Standard Oil Company, owned by John D. Rockefeller, basically controls all of the oil. It would be like if there were only one car company today, and you could only buy your car from, say, Ford. You can imagine how that would be problematic. So anyway, this cartoon is called The Bosses of the Senate. And these are all big corporations, big trusts, right? Steel Beam Trust, Copper Trust, Standard Oil, Sugar Trust. And you've noticed they're shaped like money bags, right? And here it says interests for monopolists. So all of these big industrial titans are coming in through this big entrance, and you can see here's the Senate down here. And what the artist is suggesting is that they basically own the Senate. They're the bosses of the Senate, and that was very true back then. These big trusts had tremendous influence over the government. Meanwhile, back here, it might be hard to see. This says the people's entrance, and you'll notice that the door is closed and it's locked. And so essentially what is being said is the big trusts have taken over government, and the people no longer have a say. And the country is being ruled by Rockefeller and Carnegie and all of these big trusts. Okay, let's take a look at another one. This is John D. Rockefeller, who owns Standard Oil. He's incredibly powerful. And look, so he's picking up the Capitol, and he's looking at Congress, right? Kind of like if you picked up a rock and you were looking at, bug underneath the rock. And you can't see the caption, but the caption on this political cartoon is, "What a funny little government." And so, like, the artist is saying that Rockefeller views the government as almost a little curiosity, as if you and I were to pick up a rock and look at a funny bug under it. Note in the background, the White House and the Supreme Court are a Standard Oil refinery. And so the artist is basically saying the same thing. The trusts have gotten too big. All right, here's the Treasury Department. It's a refinery. The trusts have gotten too big. They're too powerful. And we want to make sure that the people have a say in how they're governed, and that government is not dominated by these trusts. All right. So in the latter half of the 19th century, that's the latter half of the 1800s, there are all sorts of new technological innovations, government policies. We have internal migration, people moving from the south to factory cities in the north, people migrating west. We also have international migration. People are going to be coming from Europe and Asia for land and for jobs in those factories. This growth is positive for some. However, Native Americans are going to be displaced over and over and over again. Essentially, we sign a treaty, we guarantee them land, then we decide we want that land, so we take it from them. Okay. All right. So after the Civil War, remember the South was in really bad shape. So we see a lot of people leaving the South for various reasons that we'll talk about and heading west. And for about 15 years, 20 years, you get what's called the era of the American cowboys. So the period immediately before and after the Civil War was the era of the American cowboy. Now, it's a very short period of time, but it looms large, right, in our history. And that's because tons of novels were written about it. They had Wild West shows where you could go and watch people, rustle cattle and do lasso tricks and reenact fights with Native Americans and things like that. So even as it was going on, a big myth around it was built up. All right, but essentially, in reality, these cowboys, their job was to drive the cattle from down in Texas, hundreds of miles over open terrain, to train yards in places like Abilene, Kansas, where they would then go on the train to slaughterhouses and to markets in the East. Eventually, Chicago is going to become the meat packing hub for the entire West. The cowboys are going to be driven out of business by barbed wire. They're going to be driven out of business by railroads that are going to make their job unnecessary. A lot of times we think of John Wayne when we think of cowboys, but keep in mind that over a third of cowboys were Hispanic. Something like a quarter of cowboys were African Americans. So over half of them were non-white. This was a job that many people saw the pay was decent, although it was a lonely existence. Okay, and you can see these are the networks. So they're driving the cattle up to these railheads where they can be put on a train, right, and then sent back east, and then you could see this is an actual cattle drive, and you can see the cowboys. Now, eventually, the railroad networks are going to spider out. It's going to make all these long cattle drives unnecessary. Okay, so a lot of Americans are trying to rebuild their lives after the Civil War, and so they're heading west. Uncle Sam wants to incentivize. He wants to encourage people to go west. Why? To make the land productive, to mine it, to farm it, to make money for the economy. So the government introduces the Homestead Act of 1862, which gives free public land in the West. The catch is, you can't just claim it, you have to actually live on it. Okay, you can't just say, okay, I'm claiming my 160 acres and then never go there. All right, many people take advantage of this. And actually in Alaska, you could take advantage of the Homestead Act all the way up until the 1980s. It's no longer a thing, though. The number one recipient of free public land, though, railroads. Railroads got huge amounts of land for free from the government. Okay, many Southerners are headed west. Remember, the South was in bad shape after the Civil War. All right, they're looking for new opportunities in the West. African Americans are leaving the South and heading to the North and to the West because of Jim Crow and segregation. White Southerners are leaving because the Southern economy and infrastructure is ruined after the Civil War. Push factors, we call them. Okay, there's all sorts of new technology, all right, that's created that's going to help drive all of this growth. You got railroads, which we've talked about. You got the telegraph. And the way the telegraph works is you got these buttons, right? And the telegraph operator presses the button, and that makes what's called a dot, which is basically a beep. If he presses the button a little bit longer, it makes a dash, which is a long beep. So it's dot, dash. You might have dot, 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 dash. This is called Morse code. Combinations of dots and dashes equal letters. Letters equal words. A capable telegraph operator can type out a sentence pretty quick, right? Now, this seems like a rudimentary form of communication. Seems like a lot of work. Keep in mind, guys, before the telegraph, the fastest way to send a message over land was to carry it by hand. You could put a guy on horseback and ride a message 1,000 miles, and that could take weeks or months. Now, you can send a message from California to New York instantaneously. That is huge. That's revolutionary. Eventually, it'll be replaced by Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. Instantaneous communication is going to change everything, and continues to. Here's another invention that's really important. This is Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper. You recognize it. We live in an agricultural area, that this is for harvesting. It's a machine that harvests crops. This is very important. We have all of these factory cities growing. We have lots and lots of factory workers. We can't have that unless we also have mechanized, as in machine, agriculture. A farmer with a scythe cutting wheat and piling it up by hand. There's no way that they could feed a factory population. You need machines, you need an agricultural revolution to have an industrial revolution. And that's what we get with the mechanical reaper. And the seed drill, which we don't talk about, but that's a thing, that's a machine that plants seeds. So by the turn of the century, the West is no longer wild. The Great Plains and Rocky Mountains become a collection of farms, ranches, and towns. All right, you can see, here's the railroad, right? That important aspect, okay? You've got people heading west on wagons. Here's that transcontinental railroad that we talked about in our last unit that links Omaha, Nebraska with Sacramento, California. Very important project because it links east and west. Okay. Native Americans are going to be harmed greatly by this westward movement. We had promised Native Americans lands in the West. We said it was theirs to be undisturbed forever. Then we would find gold or farmland or something else. So we would violate the treaty. We would break the treaty and break the promises made to them, create a new treaty, which we would eventually also break. So the end result of this is that Native Americans were continually forced off their lands, forced off onto reservations, and killed in conflicts. It's an ugly thing. This is the Sand Creek Massacre, in which a group of Native Americans were told, hey, you can camp here, it's safe, and no one will bother you. And then U.S. cavalry attacked the village and murdered innocent people, unarmed people, including men, women, and children. Okay, this is a famous episode, and you should probably ask yourself, you know, we name all of these wars in history. We talk about the Revolution, World War I, World War II, War of 1812, the Civil War. But you don't really hear a lot about the Indian Wars. And in fact, we just call this collection of conflicts with the Native Americans Indian Wars, because they're kind of a shameful time in our history where we used our military to try to eradicate and remove Native peoples. This is an image from Custer's Last Stand. Custer was a cavalry officer who brazenly attacked a large encampment of Native Americans. The 7th Cavalry was wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Thousands and thousands of Native American warriors eradicated the 7th Cavalry. This is one of their major victories. But this conflict with the Native Americans went on throughout this period. It was a protracted campaign by the U.S. government to use the military to get the Native Americans out of the way so we could take their land. All right, you can see this is the Great Sioux Reservation as defined in the 1868 treaty. All right, and then eventually these lands are going to be taken as well. Okay, so 8B is the foundations of modern America. We talk about economic growth at the turn of the century laid the foundation for modern America. So technological change spurred the growth of industry in northern cities. Let's take a look. You have all sorts of innovations and inventions. All right. So you have the corporation. We talked a little bit about corporations already. The stock company, like the Virginia Company of London, was an early corporation. Basically, people put their money together. Okay, they invest. If the corporation succeeds, they share in the profit. If it loses money, then they lose their investment, but they don't lose everything. Corporations also have something called limited liability, and this is also referred to as corporate personhood. And so, in the eyes of the law, corporations are people. So if a corporation messes up or does something bad or goes bankrupt, the corporation, not the people that run the corporation, are held responsible. It's a little strange, I know. For an example is like the big tobacco companies. The big tobacco companies intentionally increased the amount of nicotine in cigarettes to addict people. This was decades ago. There was a whole investigation, and like there was a big settlement, but the corporations were held responsible. Individual people in those corporations were not. And by the way, if you ever see the truth.org commercials, the anti-smoking ads, those are actually paid for by money from tobacco companies as part of that settlement. We also get the Bessemer steel process, which uses these big blast furnaces. So people knew how to make steel, but it was an expensive, time-consuming process. You know, steel is much lighter and stronger than iron, but it was expensive and hard to mass produce. Well, the Bessemer process used these giant blast furnaces. These things are really big, bigger than a house. And essentially they superheat this iron and they burn off all the carbon impurities and mass produce steel. So the Bessemer process mass produces steel that's going to let us build skyscrapers. It's going to let us build bridges and trains and eventually automobiles. So it's really important. Thomas Edison invents the electric light bulb. And electricity as a source of power and light is going to change our species. Okay? It's going to change the way we live and work. The telephone by Alexander Graham Bell will replace the telegraph as a means of mass communication. And it's a little bit different. I'll show you guys. It's a little bit different than what you're used to today. The Wright brothers, they didn't invent the airplane per se. They just basically put it all together. So they had a plane that would stay in the air with a person in it, and that person could take off and land, and that person could steer the aircraft. So it was the first sustained manned flight. And we also get Henry Ford, and he doesn't invent the assembly line per se, but he introduces it to automobile manufacturing, and then it's adopted by other industries. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. All right, you get a lot of these big factory towns in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is a steel plant, I believe. All right. A lot of these companies were monopolies. Okay, they controlled all of their particular market. This political cartoon is showing how Standard Oil has run all of its competitors out of business. So there's no other oil companies that can compete with Standard Oil. And it's basically become like this unstoppable monster. And basically what the artist is saying is, hey, you know, capitalism is about competition. Businesses are supposed to compete with each other. So if we get a monopoly like this, it's a dangerous thing. A very famous sort of economist and philosopher known as Henry George, when talking about this time period, said that it is as though an immense wedge were being forced not underneath, but through society. Those who are above the point of separation are elevated, but those who are below are crushed down. And so essentially what was happening is a handful of people during this time were getting very wealthy, but the vast majority of working Americans were getting poorer. All right, so the people that were enjoying all the benefits of this booming economy were the wealthy, while the people actually producing the wealth weren't enjoying a share of it. Here's that electric light bulb patent, okay? That so Edison's light bulb. The first telephones aren't like what we have today, guys. So it was basically point to point. So you might have a telephone in your office, and then you might have a telephone at home, and then there's a line that connects the two, so you can talk between your office and home. Usually only wealthy people had them. Eventually, though, they create entire sort of phone networks, but it still wasn't like it is today. So like back then, a whole neighborhood would share a phone line, and then you'd have switchboards. So you'd call the switchboard, and you'd say, connect me to 123 Riverboat Lane or whatever. And the lady would actually take, a lot of them were women, would take the line and plug it into the line you wanted to call. And then all the phones in that neighborhood would ring. Everybody would pick up the phone and you'd be like, I'm looking for Bob, right? And then everybody else would hang up and you'd talk to them. So we've come a long way. Okay. All right. Like I said, Henry Ford invented the assembly line. He got the idea from the meat packing industry. He went to a meat packing plant and he looked, and they had these big chain-driven tracks in the ceiling with sides of beef hanging from them. And instead of one person making all the cuts and moving around a side of beef, one person, so like you might make rib cuts, or you might cut off flank steak, or you might cut off tenderloin. All day you would make the same cut, and the sides of beef would come to you on this chain-driven conveyor in the ceiling. So you could make the same cut very quick over and over again. Henry Ford said, hey, if you can do it with cows, you can do it with cars, right? And so he had a big guy. They tied a rope to the bumper of the chassis, and this big guy would pull the chassis from station to station, and the same people would do the same task over and over again. Well, eventually they replaced the big guy with a conveyor, and the same people would put on the headlights, or put on the tires, or put on the steering wheel, or whatever, put on the engine components, right? And they got so good at this and so efficient that the people building the cars could afford to buy them because the prices came down. This is going to change America. Affordable cars mean everybody's going to buy cars. We're going to start driving and traveling. It's going to lead to the creation of highway systems and interstate systems and suburbs, all kinds of stuff. All right. Here's I don't have a footage. First controlled, sustained, manned flight, Wright brothers, the airplane. Let's take a look at some of these industrial leaders from the Gilded Age. Okay, you got Andrew Carnegie. He's your steel industrial titan. He is the self-made man. Okay, he really did kind of work his way up for nothing, though. Sometimes that's a little cliche. The self-made man is a really popular thing in Americana. Some people really are self-made, some aren't. Andrew Carnegie was ruthless. He crushed strikes, but he also wanted to appeal to the public. Look at him. Who does he look like? You should think Santa Claus. That was intentional. That was what he was going for. He wanted people to think he was a kindly old man. When he crushed strikes, he had one of his henchmen do it. He always tried to make sure that he was kind of a friendly, congenial looking guy in the public eye. Later in his life, he does become a philanthropist and tries to give it all away. Builds libraries, Carnegie Hall, all that good stuff. And he's your steel titan. J.P. Morgan is your finance industrial leader, right? He financed the railroads. He organized General Electric and U.S. Steel. He bailed out the U.S. government. And there's the Panic of 1907 was an economic scare that J.P. Morgan basically said, hey, don't worry about it. I'm going to basically dump a bunch of money into the stock market and save the U.S. economy. That's a lot of power for one guy to have. All right, John D. Rockefeller is your oil industrial leader. He is also ruthless. He destroyed competitors. He's going to be exposed for the bad things that he did by a lady named Ida Tarbell, who we'll talk about later. He also becomes a philanthropist. Later in life, he builds thousands of libraries. He's responsible for the Williamsburg historic area. He had a lot of those buildings moved and restored. His company is Standard Oil. And then you have Cornelius Vanderbilt, who is your railroad industrial leader. He owned more railroad mileage than anybody. They call him the Commodore. You got to start with steamboats. Okay. One of the reasons these industries are able to grow so quickly and become so powerful and rich is because of laissez-faire economics, which means hands off. It's a French term for hands off. Now let's be clear here. The government did put its hands on the economy, but only to help these rich industrial titans. They would give the railroads land. They would give these big companies money. They would send in the military to break up strikes, but they would not regulate them. These industries were allowed to work their workers as long as they wanted. There were no environmental regulations, no safety regulations in factories. There was no minimum wage. They could pay their workers as little as they wanted to, right? And this is going to create all sorts of problems. All right. So laissez-faire, hands-off economics allowed these businesses to grow like they did. But we're going to learn some lessons. Too much government regulation in the economy can be bad, but too little can be bad too, right? And we'll talk about that. There's an increasing labor supply from internal migration from farms, from the countryside, but also from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. Immigration is going to drive our growth, as it always has. We also have a wealth of natural resources: copper, tin, lead, gold, beef cattle, pork, you name it. We have tons and tons of natural resources locked up in North America, and that's going to drive our growth. And we have navigable rivers, waterways where we can ship goods. That's a big deal. Okay. So because of all of this growth, and because of the rise of factory jobs and the Industrial Revolution, Americans find themselves with a little bit of leisure time, free time to do fun things. So we get sporting events like baseball. We get vaudeville shows. These are kind of funny little comedic shows, like these ladies boxing here would have been funny back then. They were situational comedies, as in sitcoms. We still love these today. Just back then, you had to go to like a theater and pay a nickel to see a sitcom. Now you can just watch it on TV. Amusement parks and fairs, okay, like Coney Island. Hey, look, it's the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings, one of the first baseball teams. All right. HC is immigration. And you guys need to understand that new waves of immigration at the turn of the 20th century are going to transform our society. So prior to 1871, most Americans came from Northern and Western Europe. This is Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, Norway, and Sweden. During the half century from 1871 until 1921, most immigrants come from Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay, Southern and Eastern Europe, 1871 to 1921. Places like Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, present-day Hungary, and former Yugoslavia, as well as Asia, as in China and Japan, East Asia. Just like people were hostile toward the Irish and the Germans, people are going to be hostile toward the Poles and the Greeks and the Italians and the Chinese and the Japanese, right? The sort of anti-immigrant sentiment has always been an aspect of our culture. We always tend to hate on the new wave of immigrants, even though they're coming here for the same reason that our ancestors came here. So, the old immigrants tend to hate on the new immigrants. It's a bad approach, because the United States is really an immigration success story. And so people have been coming here for the same reasons. They come here to work and learn and build a new life. And our nation has succeeded because of immigration. Like earlier immigrants, these new waves of immigrants came seeking better opportunities for their families and a new life. And you can see here people are. Right. So they entered primarily through New York. And there was a big immigration processing center in New York, at Ellis Island in New York. So they would go there and they would be processed. One of the first things that they would see as they were entering New York Harbor on their way to Ellis Island is the Statue of Liberty. So the Statue of Liberty, originally a gift from France, to basically, commemorate the fact that we were a republic and they're a republic. It was called Lady Liberty Lighting the Way, becomes a symbol of immigration, because the first thing all of these new immigrants saw when they arrived in America. And so later on, they affix a plaque, okay, to the Statue of Liberty, and it very much becomes a symbol of immigration. And this poem, The New Colossus, sort of captures that. Let's read it. It says, "Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles, from her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome, her mild eyes command. The air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame, keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp," she's talking about Europe, She said, keep your story pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Basically saying, hey, old world, send me your tired, poor masses. I want them because they're going to come here and they're going to build this nation. All right, and we certainly do. All right, so let's look at some contributions. Speaking of which, in the West, the Chinese helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. In the Northeast, immigrants work in textile and steel factories. In New York City, they work in the clothing industry. In the East, Slavs, Italians, and Poles work in the coal mines. They worked for dangerous. They worked in dangerous conditions. They worked in low pay, and they helped drive all this growth. All right. Immigrants began their process of assimilation into what was termed the melting pot. I don't really like this term, melting pot, because when you think about the United States, we're a multicultural society. We have all different kinds of religions and language groups. There's all kinds of different ethnicities. We have all sorts of different cultures. Melting pot makes it sound like we've all melted down into one thing. We're all American, but you can look around America and see all sorts of different cultures. So we're more like a salad. We're like one thing, but there are distinct parts of the salad, that you can recognize. We're not a melting pot, but the SOL wants you to know the term melting pot, so there it is. Many of these immigrants settle in ethnic neighborhoods where they could find people who speak their language, who understand their culture. They have family members there too. We also see a rise in public schooling that helps sort of assimilate these new immigrants into American society. Assimilate means kind of make the same, right? It's a little misleading, but they do very quickly, learn about American society and its history and traditions and customs and things like that. Okay, by the way, it's around this time that the Pledge of Allegiance is created. Public schools are on the rise, and so in 1892, there's a youth magazine that it was called the Youth's Companion, and the editor wanted to boost sales. And they were like, hey, I have an idea. To boost sales, let's come up with a Pledge of Allegiance. And, the celebration, of Columbus's voyage in 1892 is coming up. And so it's kind of a good time. Well, it was really popular. And pretty soon school teachers started having their students recite this Pledge of Allegiance daily. And we've been doing it ever since. So it was actually created, it was introduced in a youth magazine to boost sales. Interesting stuff. All right. Immigrants were exploited. They're exploited today. They were exploited back then. Back then, urban political machines exploited immigrants. These urban political machines are political organizations designed to generate political support for their candidates. So what they would do is these immigrants would arrive, and these political machines would take them under their wing. They'd say, hey, we're going to find you a job, find you a house. We're going to get you set up here. We're going to take care of you. But in exchange, we expect you to vote for us, okay? And they would actually have strong men. They called them shoulder hitters. And these strong men would hang out at the polls on election day. And back then, voting was very public. So they would watch you and make sure you voted for who you were supposed to vote for, all right? And if you didn't, you got roughed up. All right. Despite their contributions, immigrants faced hostility. People didn't blame the political machines and the corrupt politicians. They blamed the immigrants. They said the immigrants are the ones voting for these folks, and so they put it all on the immigrants. And so there was a lot of fear and resentment. They were afraid immigrants would take their jobs for lower pay. They were prejudiced against immigrants because their religion was different or their culture was different. This should sound familiar because we're doing the same thing today. Look at this guy's sign. It says, English is our language. Well, most of us speak English, but there's no official language in the United States. And so really this is cultural fear. These guys are concerned that immigrants are taking jobs from U.S. workers, which has really been proven to not be true. Okay. Mounting resentment leads Congress to pass laws restricting immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 bans immigration from China. And then the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, this is also known as the Immigration Restriction Act of 1921, places quotas on various countries. So if it's a Southern or Eastern European country, it has a very low quota, as in very few people are allowed to come here from those countries. If it's a Northern or Western European country like Germany or Britain, the quota is very high. Lots of people are allowed to come here from those countries. So it's really very discriminatory, and it would be illegal to do this today. But back then, it was allowed to happen. So these laws cut off immigration to America for several decades, but immigrants continued to come anyway, and they and their descendants contributed greatly to American society. Look at this political cartoon. This was used to convince people that back then that immigrants were bad. Remember, the Chinese came here and they helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. But this political cartoon is suggesting what? Look at this white family. They're pale, they're gaunt, his cheeks are sunken in, they're starving, right? And the artist is saying that the Chinese man is taking food off the table of the white family, right? And it says down here, is it right for a Chinese man to jeopardize a white man's dinner? So it's pretty racist too. But this is the kind of attitude that was encouraged, and it was really politics. How does this cartoon portray immigrants? Look at this guy, right? And you can see lots of negative stereotypes, right? Back then, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, hatred toward Jewish people. And so the artist is using that. And this barrel says Sabbath desecration. This one says poverty. This one says disease, right? And so the artist is suggesting that these immigrants are bringing in poverty and disease, and they're bringing in their culture and destroying American culture and all this kind of stuff. It says, welcome, United States, walk in. And Uncle Sam is standing there, and it says, can I come in? And Uncle Sam says, I suppose you can. There's no law to keep you out, which appears to be suggesting that we should make laws to prevent the immigrant from coming in. And you can see how this is very racist and discriminatory on a number of lines. And these sorts of attitudes were prevalent back then. They still exist today, and it's really a bad look. Because you have to remember that unless you're Native American, we all immigrated here. And so this is a nation that was really built by people that came from somewhere else, some voluntarily, some involuntarily. And we're really an immigration success story. All right. AD is racial discrimination and the early struggle for civil rights. So during the early 20th century, the Supreme Court actually limits the civil liberties of Americans. But new organizations are going to form to address segregation and issues of discrimination. Let's take a look. So we talked about Jim Crow. Remember, Reconstruction failed, and Jim Crow laws were created that forced the separation of races in public spaces. So this kind of thing would be very common during that time period. All right, you can see here's a white, black water fountain, white, black restrooms. If you went into the courtroom and you were gonna testify in court, they had you put your hand on the Bible. You say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. They had a Bible for black people and a Bible for white people. Jim Crow permeated in every aspect of Southern society. They had a social etiquette too that was designed to maintain white dominance. So this social etiquette of Jim Crow was designed to maintain white dominance. Black and white people in the Jim Crow South didn't shake hands. Black people weren't supposed to look white people in the eye. White people didn't remove their hats when they went into a black person's home or store, but black people were expected to remove their hats when they went into a white person's home or store. Black people were supposed to go into a white person's home through the back door so no one could see them going in there. For a black person to smile at, talk to, or touch a white woman was a dangerous thing to do. It was absolutely forbidden. titles were used. If you were addressing a white person, it was Mr. or Miss. Even if an older African-American man was talking to a white child, he would call that white child Mr. or Miss. And that white child would not be expected to show the same respect to that older black man or woman. Black people got titles like auntie or uncle. They were denied the basic respect of being called Mr. or Miss. And so this is all about trying to reinforce white supremacy. All right. How did they reinforce Jim Crow? Through terror, through thousands of lynchings. The police and the courts were complicit. They encouraged it. Mobs of people would take a black person and execute them in public. No trial, no jury. They would just accuse them. More often than not, these were innocent people. They didn't do anything wrong, and they were murdered by mobs to reinforce Jim Crow. This is Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a child who was falsely accused of whistling at a white woman. He was brutally murdered and his body thrown in the river. This gained national attention. People were outraged. But these lynchings went on for decades. All right, look at this. And you can see 1865, 1869, 1,500 African Americans murdered, lynched by mobs. 600, 200, 1,250, 750. So this went on. Thousands of African Americans were murdered, were lynched by mobs well into the 20th century. Okay. Discrimination and segregation were the law of the day. This is Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy tried to challenge Jim Crow, right? Homer Plessy is African American, but he could pass as what? And so his plan, and he got together with some other people, said, I'm going to ride in the whites-only train car, get arrested, and then take my case to the Supreme Court and overturn Jim Crow laws. The only thing is, by the time his case got to the Supreme Court was heavily segregationist, and so they said that separate but equal did not violate the 14th Amendment. So they actually upheld the Jim Crow laws of the day. Here's the thing, guys. Throughout the existence of segregation, separate was never equal. It did violate the 14th Amendment. Eventually, the Supreme Court will decide that, but they did not in Plessy versus Ferguson. All right. So a lot of African Americans left the South. And this is called the Great Migration, in which millions of African Americans headed for northern cities where there were jobs, there was still discrimination, but there was opportunity to work, to borrow money from banks, to advance, to send their children to school. This was looked at as, the South actually viewed this as a problem, and they were trying to figure out how to get African Americans to stop leaving the South in big numbers because they needed them there as tenant farmers, as factory workers. I guess they probably could have done it, fixed the problem by eliminating Jim Crow laws, but they weren't really willing to do that. And here it is, Great Migration from 1960 to 1930. Millions of African Americans heading to cities in the north, heading out west, right? And really just changing the demographics of the entire nation in this mass migration, huge migration. Many African Americans eventually found that the North wasn't that unlike the South. There were racist attitudes there too. We're going to run into all sorts of problems in these northern cities as well. Race riots throughout the 19-teens and 1920s, whites attacking black neighborhoods and burning them to the ground, in Greenwood and Tulsa, Oklahoma. A black man riding an elevator was accused of touching a white girl. All right, he didn't actually do it. White mobs ransacked this very prominent black neighborhood that was called Black Wall Street. They burned it to the ground. They rode the train into Tulsa just to attack it. And this happened in cities across the North in the early 20th century. So don't think that everything was perfect in the North. But there were opportunities in the North that didn't exist in the South. And so African Americans continued to migrate north. All right, I talked about the lynchings. And Ida B. Wells is going to become internationally famous for leading a crusade against the lynchings. Ida B. Wells was a journalist. She lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and she had a friend named Thomas Moss. Thomas Moss owned a grocery store, and Thomas Moss broke Jim Crow etiquette. He violated the Jim Crow etiquette. His crime, being successful. Thomas Moss owned a grocery store, and his grocery store was more successful than his white competitors. So they came to his store with guns. And guess what he did? He defended himself, and they killed him for it. Thomas Moss and two of his associates were taken to a vacant lot, and they were executed for being successful and for defending their property. Thomas Moss's last words before they shot him were, "Tell my people to go west. There's no justice for them here." Ida B. Wells would do her best to prove him wrong, to bring him justice, right? She was a good friend of Thomas Moss, and she wanted to do something about the lynchings. And so she started to write about the lynchings. People in the South would say, "Oh, well, these people were criminals. This person committed this horrible crime, and so that's why we killed them." Ida B. Wells, through investigative journalism, showed they were lying. These were innocent people that were being murdered because they were black. And she would write, she had to leave Memphis because they attacked her office. But journalism has a long reach. And so her writing about lynchings circulated around the globe and forced the federal government to step in and do something about the lynchings. They didn't all stop, but she accomplished a lot and saved a lot of lives through her writing. This is Booker T. Washington. He's an early civil rights leader. Booker T. Washington tells African Americans that they should accept segregation. He says, accept social separation and pursue vocational education. Basically what he's saying is, accept segregation, learn a trade, become economically successful, and eventually whites will accept African Americans as equals because of their economic success. Booker T. Washington accomplished a lot, and he secured a lot of jobs for African Americans in the federal government and was a prominent civil rights leader. The problem is that no matter how much economic success African Americans attain, they would never just be accepted as equals. They would have to fight for equality. Okay, so not everybody agreed with what Washington said. One of his most prominent opponents was Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois said, hey, you don't have to earn equality. It's guaranteed in the Constitution. And he said, education is meaningless without equality. He said that political equality for African Americans is something that needed to be demanded and fought for. And he helped form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That will become a very important organization as we move through the 20th century. All right, more on that later. All right. Racism was also backed up by science back then, and it's fake science. We call it scientific racism. Basically, it was this pseudoscience, this fake science that said that some races and ethnicities are naturally superior to others, and this is called eugenics. Eugenics is the belief that that some people have superior genetic traits, and that the way that you can improve humanity is to encourage reproduction by those with desired traits and discourage reproduction by those with undesirable traits. This should sound familiar. It should sound like the Nazis. That's because this is exactly what the Nazis did, except it happened right here in the United States in the early 20th century. Eugenics was a movement throughout the 20th century worldwide, and it happened right here in Virginia. Here's a eugenics building in Virginia where you could go and learn about what traits you would be ideal and who you should try to have children with. And it was a gross misuse of the principles of genetics and heredity. There was a Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, in 1927, in which the United States Supreme Court upheld a Virginia law, the word statute means law, upheld a Virginia law that said it was perfectly okay to take and sterilize people who were genetically unfit. So they could literally take these people without their permission, without the permission of their family, and make it so they couldn't have children. Right? And the Supreme Court said that that was cool. 65,000 people were sterilized against their will, without their permission or the permission of their family member. And that Virginia law also existed in 30 other states. This should give you the creeps, guys. This is what the Nazis did. And it was perfectly legal and encouraged in the 1920s. Cities were growing very rapidly in the early 20th century. Remember, all these folks are going to the urban areas to work in these factories. So that's going to be a little bit of a problem because the cities are growing faster than they can keep up with the needs of the population. So things like housing, garbage disposal, clean drinking water, sewer systems are going to be behind the growth. So these cities were not pleasant places to live. Let's take a look. Industrial cities grew. Places like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and New York grew rapidly as manufacturing and transportation centers. You had factory jobs in these cities, but the people that lived there worked in terrible conditions, and they lived in these terrible little crowded tenement apartments. Tenements, think of like a broom closet in an abandoned basement. That's a tenement, right? And neighborhoods of these tenements are called slums. So this is a tenement. This is somebody's apartment where they lived. And this is a slum, just a neighborhood of these squalid tenement apartments where people were crowded in. Housing shortages caused people to cram into these crowded tenements. If you live in the interior of these tenements, you have no windows, no light, no air. It was suffocating. You parked, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And so this guy right here, Jacob Riis, he wanted to do something about it. And he started writing about it, but nobody really seemed to pay attention. So Jacob Riis used the relatively new art of photography. And he would go into these tenements and he would take pictures of the people living in these horrible conditions. And by doing that, he made people care about it. And by people caring about it, they pressured lawmakers to fix it. And so Jacob Riis helped affect change by taking photos. New York becomes the first city to introduce the subway system. Cities start to introduce electric streetcar networks. Richmond had one of the first. All right, here's a photo by Jacob Riis. All right, look, this is a steam grate. So there's steam from a factory coming up out of this. You'll note that these kids are wearing coats and hats, and this is the wintertime in the city. But their shoes, they have no shoes. What they're doing is they're warming their feet over the steam grate, right? So Jacob Riis would show this picture to, say, suburban people who are kind of well-to-do and make them care about the suffering in the city. Here's another picture by Jacob Riis. Right. So anyway, I talked about the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain, shiny on the surface, dirty and ugly and cheap underneath. While people suffer in the cities, folks are living lavish lifestyles and lives of luxury. There's a huge gap between America's rich and poor. The monopolists like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Vanderbilt and Morgan are ruthless. They ruin their competitors. They exploit their workers by working them long hours and paying them pitiful wages. And the environment is being destroyed. And so while there is a lot of progress, a lot of economic growth, it's gilded. Because just beneath the surface, a lot of bad things are happening. All right, working conditions were terrible. All right, the hours were long and the wages were low, especially for women and children. We'll look at child labor here in a second. There's no job security. So, like, if you got hurt on the job, they just fired you. And, like, let's say you got your arm torn off by a machine, they'd say, sorry, we only hire people with two arms, so you're fired. You wouldn't be compensated. Working conditions were incredibly dangerous. I'll talk a little bit about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in a moment. People got all sorts of terrible work-related lung diseases, and people lived in company towns. Company towns are towns you live in which the company owns everything. All right, so that was a problem too. Let's take a look. This is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So a shirtwaist was like a lady's garment, all right, and this Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was like on the top floors of this building. It's called the Asheville. And so they were teenage girls. Most of them were 15, 16-year-old immigrant girls, and they worked on this factory floor in these upper floors of the building, right? And they were packed in there like sardines. They were locked inside because the owners, Isaac Harris and Max Planck, were afraid they might steal shirtwaists. So they would lock them in, and then as they left, they would search them, right? They also didn't want them taking unauthorized breaks. Well, you got to figure there's cans of oil to lubricate the sewing machines. There's bolts of fabric. There's trash cans with scraps of fabric. People are smoking in here. It's only a matter of time before you get a fire. The fire broke out. It spread rapidly. All right. There was a hose, but it wasn't connected to anything. There was a fire escape, but it collapsed. The elevator was small and stopped working after only a few women made it out. So that means that these women, hundreds of them, were trapped in these upper floors. Look at this. The fire department showed up and their ladder wouldn't reach. So women had a choice: burn or jump to your death. And many of these women leapt to their deaths as thousands of horrified New Yorkers watched. And this really caused a lot of people to head. We need the government to step in and create some regulations about working conditions, because this is just wrong. This is Pullman. It's a company town. If you lived in Pullman, you worked at the Pullman Palace Car Factory. Pullman Palace cars were like the standard for train cars. They were sleeper cars. So if you were like traveling cross country, you would ride in a Pullman car, and there was like a little bed in it and everything. You know, you had like a little cabin inside of the car, and they were like the best sleeper cars, right? Pullman Palace cars. Well, if you lived in Pullman, you worked at the factory. Pullman owned the grocery store. He supplied the electricity. He supplied the water, the postal service, the fire department, the police were all owned by Pullman. Well, there was a little bit of an economic depression. Pullman cut the wages in half, but he kept the rent and the prices at the grocery store the same. So there's going to be some problems in Pullman down the road. We'll talk about the Pullman strike later. But these company towns were a little bit of a problem. Imagine you can never really go home from work. Child labor is a huge problem during this time period. Remember I said that the government or the economy is laissez-faire, hands-off, no regulation. So basically, industries were allowed to employ children to work in their factories. All right, look at these kids. They're like 6 years old. They're standing on this machinery. This machinery is dangerous. These things are spinning rapidly. If you get your clothing caught in that, you're going to get maimed or killed. Right? Look at these kids. They're 6, 7. How old do you think this little girl is? 6 years old, maybe 7 years old. She should be in school. Instead, she's working in a dirty, dangerous factory. Look at this child right here. Well, he's 8 years old, 9 years old, elementary school kid. What is his job? He works in a coal mine. This kid probably doesn't see the sun. He goes in the mine before the sun rises. He comes out when it's dark, right? Imagine he lives his whole life in that coal mine. He goes home, he goes to bed. These kids live their whole lives in the factory. They worked 16, 17 hours a day. They ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner beside their machines. Imagine that. So that is why, like I said, some government regulation of the economy is needed, because kids were living their lives in these squalid factories, and it was an ugly thing. So labor unions emerge, and their goals are to get workers to join together and collectively bargain for higher wages, for fewer work hours, and for safer conditions. All sorts of labor organizations emerge. You get the Knights of Labor by Terence Powderly, the American Federation of Labor by Samuel Gompers, the American Railway Union by Eugene Debs, and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Let's take a look. So you got the Knights of Labor, led by Terence Powderly, and they fought for an 8-hour workday. You've got the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, fighting for higher wages and better working conditions. Okay. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, fighting against wage cuts. And the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Remember that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire? They're fighting for better, safer working conditions. These labor unions are very important. There are some strikes associated with these labor unions. There are thousands, tens of thousands of strikes in the late 19th, early 20th century. Some succeed and some don't. All right. One of them that you need to know about is the Haymarket Square riot that occurred in Chicago. It started off as a protest. Somebody threw a bomb at the police. It turned into a riot. And it ended up being a setback for the labor movement, for workers' rights, because people looked at the Knights of Labor as anarchists. And so the Knights of Labor died out as a result of the Haymarket Square riot. You also had the Homestead strike. This was at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead steel plant. All right. The steel workers wanted better conditions and better pay, so they went on strike. And this is not a peaceful strike. They blockaded the plant. They were armed. They meant business. Carnegie leaves. He leaves the country and puts his second in command, his henchman, a guy named Frick, Andrew Frick, in charge. And he says, you're going to break the strike. Do whatever it takes. Remember, Carnegie wants to be seen as Santa Claus, the good guy. So he's going to have Frick do his dirty work. Frick hires Pinkerton detectives, a few hundred Pinkerton detectives. These are basically guns for hire. There's also some local militia. They're going to go and they're going to break the strike, or so they think. They show up at the Homestead plant and they see 10,000 armed strikers. Needless to say, things didn't go well for the Pinkertons. Ultimately, the Pinkertons were forced to run a gauntlet. So like all these strikers lined up facing each other and made the Pinkertons run in between them and basically beat them half to death. This was not really a good look for the labor movement either. A lot of people saw the violence and were kind of turned off by it. Remember the town of Pullman, where Pullman owned everything and then the wages got cut? Well, guess what? Railroad workers across the nation are going to protest and riot as a result. Essentially, because they felt bad for the people living in Pullman, railroad workers say, we're not going to move a single train with a Pullman car attached. And then in many places, it devolves into violence. The government actually sends in the military, so they send the infantry in to break up the strikes. Remember, the government was hands off the economy, but they were more than willing to step in and help out the big corporations. Of the 30,000 strikes at the end of the 19th century, about half succeeded. They got limited work hours, regulated working conditions, and in some cases, better wages. So there was some success. The progressive movement was a movement that follows this Gilded Age. So you get the Gilded Age, and the response to the Gilded Age is the progressive era. So Gilded Age, that time of, great progress, but also great suffering, gives way to the progressive era, in which we're like, hey, you know what? Let's fix democracy. Let's fix the economy. Let's fix society so that everybody can enjoy all of this growth. So basically, the progressive movement wants to reform, that means improve, the economy, politics, and social systems. Take a look at how they're going to do that. So some causes of the progressive movement. Remember, we talked about economic exploitation. Exploitation means taking advantage of somebody or something for your benefit. So things like the trusts, the big monopolies. Remember the bosses of the Senate? We need to break those up. Capitalism is about competition. Trusts and monopolies are anti-competitive. They're not good for the economy. We also need to do something about the exploitation of natural resources. We need to protect the environment. Political corruption is a cause of the progressive movement. Those political machines that are exploiting immigrants, we need to do something about those. We need to do something about bribes and voter intimidation. We need to expand democracy. Social justice is a cause of the progressive movement. We need to do something about child labor. We need to do something about those tenements and slums, those horrible living conditions. Consumer protection. And I'll get into this in a little bit, but guys, The food and the medicine that was being sold back then was dangerous and in some cases deadly. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. There is also issues with racial, gender, and ethnic inequality, and we need to fix that. So the goals of the progressive movement: increase economic opportunity, give people a chance to make a better life for themselves. Increase democracy, give people an opportunity to participate in government. Get rid of the bosses of the Senate and make it a government of, by, and for the people like it's supposed to be. And increase social justice, eliminate discrimination. All right. One of the aspects of the progressive era is Roosevelt's square deal. Teddy Roosevelt, who, by the way, became known as a trust buster. He wants to break up those big corporations. So you can describe Teddy Roosevelt's square deal platform with the 3 C's. Conservation of natural resources. Teddy Roosevelt's actually going to create the national park system. Control of corporations. Let's regulate these big businesses a little bit, and let's break up these monopolies and create some competition so that everybody can benefit. And consumer protection. Let's have some standards. Things like the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, all right, which we'll talk a little bit about. Roosevelt wanted to help middle-class citizens by eliminating what he called bad trusts and other social evils. So, for example, the Elkins Act was part of this platform. Railroads back then, what they would do is they would give rebates to certain companies. So, like, the railroad would tell Rockefeller and Standard Oil, hey, we're going to charge you less to transport your oil than your competitors. So we'll run your competitors out of business by making your transportation costs lower. And in exchange, you agree to move your oil on our railroad. So they would conspire with each other. And by doing so, they would run their competitors out of business. Well, that's not fair. It's not competitive. That's not capitalism. So they made it illegal. All right. Wilson's New Freedom will also dovetail off that. Now, Wilson, just for the record, Wilson is pretty racist. All right, the guy was a known racist. He celebrated the Ku Klux Klan film, Birth of a Nation. So he's not a great guy. All right, he is a progressive era president. He wanted to attack the 3 walls of privilege, but I just want to be transparent about what kind of person he was. He wanted to get rid of tariffs. Remember, we talked about tariffs, taxes on foreign goods that protect domestic industries, but they protect the industrialists at the expense of consumers. So if you're an American company, you should compete for American dollars by making a better product at a lower price, not by being protected by tariffs. He went after banks that favored the wealthy, and he, like Roosevelt, went after trusts that he said were too big and too corrupt. So those trusts, those monopolies are going to be broken up, and certain business tactics are going to become illegal. A big part of the progressive era were muckrakers. Muckrakers are progressives who use investigative journalism to expose, so rake up the muck and expose abuses in politics and economics and society. Think Ida B. Wells. She was a muckraking journalist. She exposed the evils of the lynchings and to the world and got the government to do something about it, got people to care about it. So she's a good example. We'll look at a few others. Upton Sinclair writes a book called The Jungle. Let me see if I have an extra. I do have an extra. He writes a book called The Jungle, and it's about the wretched conditions in meatpacking plants, the inhumane treatment of the animals, and the inhumane treatment of the workers. He famously says, I aim for the public's heart, but I hit them in the stomach. Let's take a look at why The Jungle was such a powerful piece of muckraking journalism. All right, this is a quote from The Jungle. It says, there were the wool pluckers, whose hands went to pieces even sooner than the hands of the picklemen. For the pelts of the sheep had to be painted with acid to loosen the wool, and then the pluckers had to pull out this wool with their bare hands till the acid had eaten their fingers off. There were those who made the tins for the canned meat, and their hands, too, were a maze of cuts, and each cut represented a chance for blood poisoning. Some worked at the stamping machines And it was very seldom that one could work long there at the pace that was set. So they were working very quickly and not give out and forget himself and have a part of his hand chopped off. And as for the other men who worked in tank rooms full of steam, and in some of which there were open vats near the level of the floor. So there were vats of boiling oil that were at the same level as the floor. And their peculiar trouble was that sometimes they fell into the vats. So they would fall into these vats of boiling oil. And when they were fished out, there was never enough of them left to be worth exhibiting. Sometimes they would fall into the vats and be overlooked for days, till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Durham's pure leaf lard. So people would fall into the vats, they would be boiled, the flesh would be boiled off their bones, and that would be sent out to the public's breakfast before anybody found out about it. If this turns your stomach, it should, but imagine you are reading this after having eaten Durham's pure leaf lard. You're going to be upset. Like I said, he aimed for their heart, he hit him in the stomach, right? Ida Tarville, another muckraking journalist, she writes a series called The History of the Standard Oil Company. Her dad was a Pennsylvania oil refiner who Rockefeller ruined. So this was personal for her, all right? So she investigates the Standard Oil Company and finds all sorts of evidence that they did all sorts of illegal and dishonest things to succeed. She shows that Rockefeller cheated the whole way. And because of her writing, the Supreme Court found that the Standard Oil Company had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. So they're going to break up the Standard Oil Company. Here's a quote from her book. It takes time to crush men who are conducting legitimate business. But one of Mr. Rockefeller's most impressive characteristics is patience. And there is nothing too small. The little grocery store in Browntown, the humble refining still in Oil Creek, for little things grow. So basically what she's saying is Rockefeller doesn't care how small the company is. If it competes with them, he's going to crush it. Her writing goes a long way in breaking up the Standard Oil Company. So we see a couple of antitrust laws, anti-monopoly laws that go after these trusts. The first one that's passed is the Sherman Antitrust Act, which says no restraint on trade. Now, it's an antitrust law, so it's supposed to be used against the trusts, like Standard Oil, right? But it's actually used against the labor unions. They say that the labor unions, by going on strike, are restraining trade, and they use it against the labor unions. So it's not actually used against the people it's intended to be used against. So later on, you get the Clayton Antitrust Act, which expands the Sherman Antitrust Act. It exempts unions, okay, and it outlaws price fixing, things like the railroad rebates that I talked about later. Companies can't artificially conspire with each other to fix prices. You've got to let the market determine prices because that's capitalism. We also get the Federal Reserve System. And I always describe the Federal Reserve to my students as like a gas pedal and brake for the economy, right? And so if you borrow money, you have a credit card, or if you take out a loan, you're borrowing money, but you got to pay that money back, right? With interest, with a percent interest, okay? And the Federal Reserve is a banker's bank. So the Federal Reserve lends money to banks, and those banks lend money to people. If the Federal Reserve wants to speed up the economy, like during the pandemic, all this unemployment, the economy is doing pretty bad. So the Federal Reserve will lower interest rates. This encourages people to borrow money, it increases the money supply, and it speeds up the economy. Well, let's say things are going pretty good, and the Federal Reserve wants to pump the brakes a little bit and slow things down. You don't want a roller coaster. You don't want wild ups and downs. You want slow, predictable growth over time because that's good for the economy in the long term. So what they'll do is they'll raise interest rates. This will slow things down a little bit. It'll encourage people to save a little bit more, and it will actually increase the value of the dollar. So the Federal Reserve, by raising and lowering interest rates, and then there's something called the reserve ratio that I won't get into, can manipulate the money supply, and speed up and slow down the economy as needed. All right, some political accomplishments of the progressive era. Primary elections are established. So think about this presidential elections, 2020, and the year that this was recorded is 2020. It's an election year. You might be listening to this in another year, but maybe you've lived through an election year, and you notice that you don't start off with a Republican and a Democrat and an independent candidate. Though they are chosen by the states through a series of primary elections, and the same thing happens with congressmen too. Used to be that these folks were just chosen by party bosses, right? But now the people get to choose from a wide array of candidates, so it's more democratic. The 17th Amendment will also be passed, and we're going to get to vote. People are going to get to directly elect senators. It used to be that senators were chosen by state legislatures. So Virginia has 2 senators. Remember, we talked about Congress. The House of Representatives is based on population. The Senate, everybody gets 2. And Virginia's 2 senators would have been chosen by the Virginia General Assembly. Not anymore. After the 17th Amendment, we vote for it. We also get the secret ballot, as in nobody knows who you vote for unless you tell them. This is good. Remember I talked about those urban political machines who had the shoulder hitters, the strong men who would intimidate immigrants into voting for who they wanted them to vote for? Not anymore. Now the ballot is secret. This is a big one right here, guys. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. All right. Remember we talked about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony way back in 1848 started this movement. Their torch is picked up by Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, who continue to campaign, and in 1919, finally, women get the right to vote. That's going to be revolutionary. All right, primary elections. This is from the 2016 election. You had all of these different candidates to choose from before it was finally whittled down to these 2. So that's primary election. It's not specified in the Constitution. It's been done differently over time, but it's a product of the progressive era. Remember I said senators used to be elected by state legislatures, but now people elect senators in the same way we elect representatives in the House. Okay. There was a big pushback against women getting the right to vote. This is from the early 1920s, and this is from the Virginia Association of Women Opposed Women's Suffrage. And let's take a look at what they're saying. It says, men, you're making the world safe for democracy and safe for women. Your mothers, sisters, and wives may never have to suffer as the women of Belgium and France have suffered. All women, thank you. Men manage the businesses. Our government is a business. Most women want men to manage government. Only a few women want suffrage. Basically what they're saying is only a few women actually want to vote. Shall these few women force all women into politics? Women can do their best bit outside of politics, right? So basically what they're saying is, oh, women don't really want to vote. It's only a few. It's a lie. Women wanted to vote, right? Here, look at this political cartoon. A suffragette's home. So a suffragette is a women's rights activist. Remember, suffrage is voting rights. So a suffragette is a woman fighting for women's voting rights. See, it says vote for women back in an hour. And look at this poor guy. He's been at work all day, and he comes home after a hard day's work, right? His children are tired, and his house is a mess. Basically, people argued that if women get the right to vote, it'll destroy the American family. That's a lie, and people weren't terribly impressed. Look at this one. It says, a woman's mind magnified. Basically, they're saying that she's too busy thinking about hats, which man to marry, babies, puppies, chocolate, and dresses. She doesn't have room in her mind for politics. Pretty offensive. And then, of course, there's this one. Why is this baby crying? Because mommy is a suffragette. Mommy is voting for mommy is fighting for the women's right to vote. Anyway, the reason that all of this happened wasn't because people actually believed that women weren't capable of understanding or leading. They were afraid of women getting the right to vote. They wanted to keep women in a subordinate position. And so they created all this propaganda to subjugate and oppress women. Guess what? It didn't work. Women got the right to vote thanks to these two ladies, Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt. Right? Look, she's in jail. She went on hunger strikes. She would talk to the president. So these people continued the fight that Stanton and Anthony began in 1848. 41 years later, they won it. Right? It says the rights, the 19th Amendment says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Right? So it's introduced in 1878 and passed 41 years later, 1919, 1920. Seneca Falls Convention was in 1848. It's a long time coming. Alice Paul did White House protests and hunger strikes. Carrie Chapman Catt was the movement leader, and she put political pressure on Woodrow Wilson. Another progressive accomplishment is social. We're going to get the consumer protection that we need. With the Meat Inspection Act, which we really need. Remember Upton Sinclair's The Jungle? You need to inspect the meat, clear. And the Pure Food and Drug Act, and I'll show you guys some examples of why we need that. What's also going to happen during the progressive era is prohibition. All right? The 18th Amendment, known as prohibition, is going to make it illegal to manufacture, transport, or sell alcohol. People don't stop drinking, guys. It really just creates organized crime. Eventually, they think better of it and pass the 21st Amendment, which repeals prohibition. Just remember, 21 is the drinking age. 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. We also see a rise in public schooling, which I spoke about, to assimilate immigrants. Let's take a look. Why do we need consumer protection? Well, we needed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act because a lot of the things that were being marketed were dangerous. They could make you sick and kill you. Look, cocaine tooth drops. All right? Snake oil liniment. This is snake oil. Relieves headaches, cures neuralgia, toothache. It didn't actually do any of these things. It said if you're deaf, it'll make you be able to hear again. That's crazy. Look at this. Heroin. Bayer heroin. Presumably some sort of medicine for headaches or something. Here's something really weird. Radium back then was all the rage. There was radium in pill form. There was radium hand cleaner. This is a radium back pad if you have a backache. Well, what's wrong with radium pills and hand cleaner and back pads? Radium is radioactive. It will kill you. All right. You might get a little boost of energy because your white cell count goes up, but it's definitely not something you should. It's an alkaline earth metal. It's radioactive. So we need consumer protection. All right. The 18th Amendment, prohibition, banned the manufacture, sale, transportation, and distribution of alcohol. This is called a John Barleycorn. So when prohibition went into effect, the night before it went into effect, they had these big raucous parties because it was the last night that alcohol would be legal, right? And so they had these fake funerals where they were basically having a funeral for alcohol. John Barleycorn, barley corn hops makes alcohol. So they would have these big raucous parties that were like funerals, right, where they would pretend to bury John Barleycorn. All right, but guess what? Nobody stopped drinking. You had moonshiners, bootleggers, smugglers. Look at that. That's creative. They would smuggle the alcohol. They had speakeasies, secret bars where people would go to drink. People like this man right here, Al Capone, became super wealthy off of illegal alcohol manufacture, distribution, and sale. So we didn't really stop drinking. We just made gangsters rich. Oh, but we did get NASCAR. People like this, the bootleggers, right? They would make really fast cars so they could outrun the cops. And they started racing each other in their spare time. And so that's where NASCAR came from. Some state government accomplishments from the progressive era. You get new forms of government. So people want more say in what's going on in their towns and cities. And so instead of just a state government and national government, you get local governments, commissions, councils, manager roles. So people get more say in what's going on around them. We have a board of supervisors, a school board. We have local commissions, councils, and manager roles so we can determine what's going on in Middlesex, right? So we get more say in what's going on around us. Finally, I want to talk about these three state government types of voting. referendum, initiative, and recall. Referendum, when you think of referendum, think of the state legislature chickening out. They chicken out. Let's say that the Virginia General Assembly wants to introduce year-round school, but they know it's a hot issue and people might get mad. So instead of deciding themselves, they put it on the ballot. Basically, they tell people, hey, do you want year-round school? If you say yes, then we'll have year-round school. They refer it down to the people. All right, now there's another thing that can happen, the initiative. So when you think of initiative, think the people take initiative. So let's say the people want year-round school. They start a petition, people sign the petition, and then the state legislature votes yes or no on it. So the people take initiative and raise it up to the government. Finally, we have recall. Recall is when you remove, at the state level, you remove an elected official from office. So like an attorney general or even a governor, let's say they do something really bad, you can have a recall election where people literally vote them out of office. So there's more democracy at the state level. All right, that concludes our SOL 8 lecture. Make sure you do the discussion board, do the guided notes, and read the narrative and answer the questions. And I will see you guys next time.